Today is all about Esterbrook pens, and in particular what they call the pump piston filler, which is in these two pens right here. Now I'm sure all of you are saying, wow, super exciting, the pump piston. Can't wait to hear about it. Well, don't be so dismissive so quickly, because the reality is that this pen combines two aspects of history. One, it's the history of Esterbrook, and two, it's the history of filling systems in vintage fountain pens. They come together in a great little package. I want to share all of this with you now, so let's get to it. I'm Joshua Lax, fountain pen user, collector, a bit like all of Andrews, right? And all-around fanatic. In fact, I'm so obsessed, I started a business where I get to work with other people's pens. But now I want to show you everything I love about the world of fountain pens. From the new pens, to the old pens, the nibs, the ink, the paper, and especially the people. This is Uncapped. For those new to fountain pens, or if you stumbled into this video and are hearing about fountain pens for the first time, let me just give you a quick look at what a modern fountain pen, meaning something that was manufactured basically in the last 40 years, looks like in terms of how it's made and what the parts are. So we have here what's called the Esterbrook King of the Night. It is a fountain pen, and it consists of the typical 5 parts, we'll call it, of a modern fountain pen, putting aside any sort of specialty item or more unusual filling system that we'll talk about in a second. So there's 5 basic pieces, and you see here we have the barrel, we have the section, and the cap. And inside the barrel, connected to the section, what you're going to find is a nib unit and then a cartridge or converter. Right, so this is a converter. It's basically a means of drawing ink into the pen, and you do that by twisting around. Most people, I think, watching this will know this, but for those who are new, I give you that quick piece of background information before we get into it. But basically, if you bought a fountain pen, a basic fountain pen manufactured in the last 40 or 50 years, it's going to follow this basic format. Now, different than this pen, the King of the Night, are these pens, which have, as I said, the Esterbrook Pump Piston. And that filling system works quite a bit differently. So you have, obviously, the standard parts that you can see with your naked eye, except you have this new piece here, which is called a blind cap. And when you remove the blind cap, you open it and reveal what is basically the operable part of the filling system. And so the way the pump piston works is you submerge the nib in ink, bottle of ink, dish of ink, inkwell, what have you, and you push down on the rod, which is up here, and that operates the filling system, and you see it snaps back, and that allows ink to be drawn into the pen. I will explain how all of this works in a moment, but I just wanted to give folks an orientation of these two different filling systems to understand what it is we're talking about and what makes them special. Before we go any further, I should give you a quick disclosure or perhaps disclaimer, which is to say that I have a connection and an interest in the Esterbrook Pen Company. That interest is not an ownership interest, but I do nibs for the Esterbrook nib program for which I am compensated. So I have an agreement where I receive nibs from Esterbrook. I modify them to be one of 2 models, either the Scribe or the Flex Fude, and I send them back, and I'm paid for that. You should all know that if you didn't know it already, but I want you to have that information. Hopefully, despite my connection to Esterbrook, you'll find this video interesting and credible, but I could not continue further without telling you a little bit about this so you can make up your own mind. Now back to the pens. One of the reasons I wanted to do this video is to talk to you about the historical background of this pump piston filler. For one thing, I really like this type of filling system. I always have since I got into fountain pens back in 2009. I've always really been drawn to, no pun intended, the pens that have a similar filling system going back to the 1930s. And in fact, 15 years ago, if you asked me, Josh, what would you like to see brought back into the world of fountain pens? I would have told you this is exactly what I would have wanted. And again, they're not the only ones doing it. That is, Esterbrook is not the only ones doing it. But nonetheless, it's being given in a really great package. And we'll compare kind of what's out there in a little bit in terms of the modern offerings. Let's for a moment discuss where these pens fit in with the history of Esterbrook. So many people know that Esterbrook was a pen brand that existed for several decades in the United States. I believe it had some origins in the United Kingdom. It came over to the United States. It was based for a period of time out of Camden, New Jersey, and it was a huge company. The pens were ubiquitous, and in fact, even now, if you go to a flea market and someone has fountain pens, odds are is that there's going to be vintage Esterbrook sitting in the box, the cup, the pile, what have you. All that's to say is that it is considered one of the great American vintage pen brands. But then, like many great American vintage pen brands, it went defunct as fountain pens went out of fashion. Several years ago, Kenro, which is primarily was a distributor of writing instruments and other luxury items, brought back Esterbrook. When Kenro introduced Esterbrook, they started with the Estie in a cartridge converter format, and then at some point later, they began offering the Esterbrook Estie in the pump piston, and in fact, a number of models now come both either, well, you can choose whether you want a cartridge converter or if you want the pump piston, that is available to you. Now, I think a lot of people assume that this offering from the current Esterbrook, where you can get pens that are cartridge converters or pump piston fillers, is something that is specific to the new Esterbrook. That is Esterbrook after it was revived by Kenro several years ago. And in fact, I think that part of that comes from the perception that Esterbrook's big models were things like this, right? So this is an Esterbrook J model. It is, I would agree, the sort of quintessential vintage Esterbrook model. It has all the trappings that Esterbrook is now known for, right? So it's a fairly ubiquitous and inexpensive vintage pen. It's made out of this really colorful celluloid you see in front of you. It has, and I'm going to tell you the nib on this one's a little damaged, so this is not how it should look, but it has what's called the relief points where you could screw out the nib unit and screw it back in. One of the early pens to offer that, and they offered these in a number of different types of nibs, so you could sort of customize the pen itself based on your preferences and functions that you needed the pen to help you with. The other big thing is that in addition to being a celluloid pen and having what I just showed you, it is a lever filler. So this is the lever. There is, and I believe this needs to be repaired, so it's not going to work properly, but there is a rubber sack that is supposed to be in here, and when you wanted to fill the pen, you would submerge it into ink and you would lift this lever, and the lever would depress a bar inside the pen, pushing down on that rubber sack. That rubber sack would then be released when you push or put the lever back in place, and that would cause vacuum pressure to expand, and because the nib was submerged, that would draw the ink into the pen. Right? All these pens, the game is how do you get ink to go into the pen, essentially. And that's a lot of what this episode is actually going to be about. Putting aside, before we get ahead of ourselves, this is what I think a lot of people would think of as the quintessential fountain pen from Esterbrook. The Esterbrook J, there was the dollar pens that were similar to this. You know, everyone is right when you think of Esterbrook if you're thinking of this. But that's not the entire story. And in fact, one of the reasons I wanted to do this video is because I wanted to show folks that, in fact, this idea of cartridge converters, pump pistons, right, it's actually something that does come from the vintage Esterbrook. As I said earlier, Esterbrook was in existence for a number of decades, and in the course of those decades, it introduced a number of models. So again, One of the major models, sort of what many people are familiar with when they hear Esterbrook, is this J model. You know, as I said, the celluloid, the clip, everything. It's sort of an iconic model, and it's sort of representative of what people think about when they think about Esterbrook. On the other hand, you have other models that came out like these. So let me introduce you to the Esterbrook Safari. I kid you not, that is its name. Before the Lamy Safari, there was the Esterbrook Safari. And like the modern iterations, this is one of the points I'm trying to make to you all, is it came in two different formats. So these two smaller pens here are cartridge pens. That is, they fill by inserting a cartridge into the pen, and that is the ink supply. Or they had their own push piston version, which I'll talk to you about in a second. But let me just show you first this cartridge converter. So, sorry, just cartridge. So basically they were inexpensive pens. You know, the plastic is not great. You can see it's like injected molding. No one did any sort of polishing to hide that fact. It's got a steel nib. The steel nib is in good shape, but it's just a little dirty. You're going to see in a second, I'm going to open up the pen here, and this ring comes off, so I got to be careful. I know it's a rough example, but nonetheless, I wanted to show people what these things look like. So here is a sort of warped and demented cartridge that goes with the Esterbrook Safari. You can see kind of the text here. It actually says cartridge. I think it says ink cartridge, and it has some other information there. But anyway, this was the cartridge filling version of the Safari. In addition to the cartridge converter pens, there was a push piston of sorts, and that was contained in this pen right here, or is contained in this pen right here. And you can see it's a much nicer pen. You got this nice cap that has much better detailing. The engraving looks nicer. I mean, it's in better condition, but it is a nicer pen. It had a ability to swap nibs out, because unlike these two, I think you can actually screw the nib out, screw a different one in. So if you wanted a different size like these, you could customize it that way. But the thing I really want to talk about is this filling system that's contained in here. So as I said, this is a push piston. It just works a bit differently than this one. So how does this one work? Oops, sorry. Basically what happens is there is this blind cap here, which I'll unscrew in a second, but that has a hole in the end of it. And when you unscrew it and you withdraw it from the pen, you see that there's a black tube here. So it's open from this hole into the tube. And then inside the pen, which you can't see here underneath the barrel, is a piston head that has some sort of O-ring around it. And that piston head is open on the inside, sort of looking into the rest of the barrel. Following down from that piston head, and if you push it down, that probably stops about here. So in that space where the piston head doesn't go is a rubber sac or diaphragm that's smaller than what would go in here. That would be bigger, right? It would fit the barrel. Here it is sized to basically avoid touching that piston head. And the way this worked was it was basically a pneumatic filler, or what we would call a pneumatic filler. So you would, when you wanted to fill the pen, you would unscrew the blind cap, take out the tube there. You would submerge the nib into ink. You would cover the back of this blind cap with your finger, and then you would push. When you pushed, it would send this piston head down towards the rubber sac that's in here. But because you were covering it, it was creating pressure in that downward motion that was causing this sac to compress, right? And then when you got all the way down and it slid into place, to release the sac and allow it to draw in the ink, you would remove your finger. Air would then enter through the tube into the piston head and then into the barrel. That would release the pressure on the sac. The sac would spring open because it's made out of latex, and that vacuum pressure that was created in the sac would draw ink up into the pen. So essentially it was a one-handed filling motion. Sorry, let me zoom out a little bit. It worked just like that. Lest you all think me a teller of tall tales, I want to actually demonstrate this pen's filling system in action for you. So as I explained earlier, right, there is a blind cap that we are going to actually withdraw and pull out, and there's the rod that's hollow in the center. And what we're going to do is I'm going to submerge the nib into the water here, and then I'm going to push down with my finger on the back of that blind cap. Now what you should see when I do that is a series of air bubbles coming out of the pen. And what that will be is actually the compression on that sac from the pressure, pushing the air out, and then when I release it, it will suck the water up into it. And you won't really see that happening other than the air bubbles. So there were the air bubbles. I released that. And probably in real life, I would do a second go with it just to make sure that the max fill could be achieved. But it's not a very high volume pen, and I think that's one of the problems with things that were offered like this. Anyway, so what you do to empty it is essentially you go in reverse. So rather than submerging it, I'm going to do the same thing, cover the blind cap, but you'll see that water actually squirts out in some decent amount for what it is, right? So even after all this time, this thing fills. I have no idea if this has ever been restored. I don't think it has been. So, 50, 60-year-old pen still works like that. I mean, that's a pretty impressive feat. And one of the arguments I would give you all for if you're afraid to get vintage pens for looking at them, because they are very well manufactured. Now you may be asking, what is the difference between the vintage Esterbrook Safari and the push piston pens that are currently available? Well, they operate completely differently. So in this iteration of the push piston, you have a filling system that operates not on the basis of a sac, but actually a system that fills directly into the barrel. And the way it works is you simply submerge the nib in the inky water, the ink, whatever, and you push down on that rod that's at the back. And what it does is it sends a piston head downward and it pushes the air out. And then when it releases and that snapback takes place, it draws ink up through a tube that's in here. So you can see little air bubbles coming out. That is the pen filling, because it's really a displacement of air to ink when you're filling a pen. And you can see just emptying it right now. Now, to understand where this filling system comes from, we need to talk about pens that are even older than this. And in fact, that is one of the things I find exciting about this offering from Esterbrook, is that this is basically a retooled version of one of the original, iconic, great, complicated filling systems of the 30s and 40s, which is the Parker Vacumatic. So what you have here is 4 examples of Parker Vacumatic filling systems. The 2 in the front here are the iconic Vacumatic. This is the model Vacumatic. This is what's called a duofold. Many of you may not be familiar with this version of the duofold, but it has a Vacumatic filling system. And finally, we have a Parker 51 Vacumatic demonstrator, but it's not an original demonstrator. It is a reproduction, meaning that it uses Parker parts, but the cap, the barrel, the blind cap here, the jewels at the end, those are all reproduction. So it's a reproduction made by someone who had access, I think it's Ariel Kulak, to machining and equipment from Parker, and basically was able to make a reproduction of a Parker demonstrator, which is a fairly rare pen. A demonstrator, by the way, was created with the purpose of allowing the seller of the pen to demonstrate to people what the pen was and how it filled. And so literally this serves our purpose, and is the historical basis for it, is it's going to demonstrate for us how the Vacumatic works. But we'll get back to that in a second. What I wanted to just tell you is The Parker Vacumatic was introduced, I believe, in around 1933, 1934. The filling system had several iterations, which was affected starting in the early 40s by the fact that World War II required certain materials to be preserved for the war effort. And so Parker made some changes to the design, and I think these are actually 40s Vacumatics here. All of them, though, have the same Vacumatic filling system that I'm going to talk about with regard to the demonstrator. And they all work sort of the same way. The difference here is that these are all celluloid. So this pen here, the Duofold that I'm holding, is, I forget if it's called striated celluloid or it has a different name, but you can see it has this really cool brown and green color that is then interspersed with either black celluloid or what was originally clear but now from age has ambered. And if you kind of hold it up to the light, you can see that you can actually see through the barrel, and so you could see the ink level in the pen once you filled it. The same is true here, although it may be a little hard to see, but you can see that there is like those transparent spaces between the celluloid. This, by the way, and this is what's called the stacked celluloid. So some of you may be familiar with stacked celluloid from Visconti because they used a version of it in some more modern pens, but this stacked celluloid is sort of like the classic Parker look for the Vacumatic. I think when people think of a Parker Vacumatic, they think of this design. It's, as iconic, as, associated with the identity of the brand as perhaps the Esterbrook J is with the old Esterbrook company. This pen doesn't really have any translucency. I think actually they made the barrel out of the same stacked celluloid as the cap. It also has this weird diagonal thing going on, but nonetheless, you can see these pens from probably, I think all of these are from the 40s, all three of these, have the Vacumatic filling system. So what is the Vacumatic? Well, let's take a look at the Parker 51 reproduction to understand a little bit more, and probably the Vacumatic deserves its own video. There's a number of iterations, there's a really interesting history behind it, but let's just talk about the nuts and bolts of this thing. So, again, like many modern pens, it has a cap, it has a section, although this is a hooded nib in the Parker 51. Hooded just simply means the section covers most of the nib. It has a barrel, and like many of the pens with a more interesting filling system, it has a blind cap. So let's take off the blind cap and put it to the side for a moment. And so you're looking at the basic design of the Parker Vacumatic. So it was a nib and feed that had a tube called a breather tube that came out the back of the feed. I'll explain a little more in a second. And then it had the Vacumatic filling unit. So the filling unit consists of, and I actually have one outside a pen I can show you. So the way this works is there's a plastic or celluloid plunger. This, on certain Vacumatic filling systems, the original ones was metal, and it had there was something called the speed line, there was something called the lockdown filler. It ultimately ended up resulting in this format here, particularly when World War II started and they needed to conserve some of those materials. They switched to plastic, and then eventually these became plastic, although in most of them you find they're going to be metal. So basically what the filling unit consists of is the rod is connected to this unit here, which is metal, and when screwed into the pen, this threads right here that I'm rubbing my finger on go into the threads right there, right? And before you would put this back in, and you need a special tool to actually do this, otherwise you'll break the whole filling unit, you would fold this down and back over this kind of beveled, slanted edge here. So what would happen is this gets folded down over here, this gets screwed in, this stuff sits in here, and this metal piece holds the end of the rubber diaphragm against the inside of the pen, so that when you push down, you can see there's a spring there. When you push down, this sends the diaphragm forward. Now, what's happening when you do that? So we got to go back to this part of the pen. And these pens also have the same exact design on the inside. The innards are the same. So basically what happens is when you push down on the plunger rod, right, you're expanding the space that this diaphragm takes up. And that pushes air out of the barrel. So that will go through the feed system. And when you let go, the spring causes it to go back. That diaphragm retracts. And when it retracts, you get the vacuum or vacuumatic pressure that draws the ink into the pen. And the way that this worked, and it's kind of ingenious, is that this breather tube here would allow the ink to fill into the barrel. So basically, when you retracted this filling unit, or you retracted you pushed down and then the diaphragm went back, it would suck ink through this breather tube. Now, why is it called the breather tube? One of the things that makes a fountain pen work is the ink air exchange. So in all fountain pens, what happens is ink travels from inside the pen down into the feed and then into the tip. Now, under the nib, in the space between the feed and the nib, air is going through the nib back into the pen, right? So there's a continuous cycle that is allowing ink to travel forward and air to travel back, right? And that's why, something, when the ink depletes, it becomes mostly air, because that cycle is occurring. And that is occurring inside this pen like any other. However, the way the technology works is a little different, because they needed to be able to allow ink to travel into the feed. And one of the innovations they came up with was drilling a hole into the feed and into the back of the feed and putting this tube in. So once you're done filling this no longer carries liquid. The breather tube specifically no longer carries liquid, right? So in the filling process, ink comes up this way. But once you're done, that tube is no longer used to allow ink to travel. What happens is it is the breather, right? Hence the name breather tube. It's allowing the air to come over the feed into that tube and into the back of the pen. And that is a fairly ingenious innovation when they design these pens. And one of the reasons I think it is such an important design is because it had some of these really interesting technological innovations. So let me show you what actually happens when you fill it. And then we'll get back to the Esterbrook and the modern iterations of this. So I have here, right, the water that we've been using, and I'm going to fill this. And I'm going to fill this in the same way that I filled the Esterbrook, which is you submerge the nib and then you push down on the rod. Now, what I want you to pay attention for here is this is actually a plastic step in there. No, it's definitely a plastic step, right? So what you're going to see is as I actuate the filling mechanism, liquid is going to come up through that tube, and then the water level inside the barrel here is going to start to rise. So you just saw some air bubbles as I pushed down, right? And then you can see liquid is now starting to fill inside the barrel of that pen. Again, we push down, you see some air bubbles, and there goes the liquid. Now, these things are a little bit annoying to clean out because you have to sit there and literally, sort of pump out the liquid. And one of the things you got to do is you got to go slow with the liquid, because if you go too fast, it just pushes air out. But if you want to actually get the water level down or the ink level down, you got to go slow and let it gently kind of decrease, which I won't waste all your time here. Now, this filling system was in use by Parker from basically like 1934-ish, 1933, through to around, I think people think the consensus is 1948. Now, why did they phase this out? It's an interesting filling system. Well, they came up with the aerometric filler, which is much more like a converter where you like squeeze and it sucks ink up. And, not for nothing, this is kind of an annoying thing to have to deal with. You need a special tool to remove it. You have to replace the rubber diaphragm. There's a whole procedure, which we're not going to get into right now, for how to do that. And you got to put a new one in. If ink dries in the pen, it could affect and damage the rubber diaphragm. If you, go too hard on it, maybe it ruptures or something like that. It is a durable pen, but this is a little bit, what's the best word for it? It's not something that will last forever. Like, it's not, it's durable, but it's not permanent. Let's say it that way, right? And so what you are left with, and then just, FYI, the cleaning of this thing also can be kind of annoying, because you have to, like I said, sit there and try to pump out the ink. So at some point, the Vacumatic, although a brilliant and wonderful filling system, got phased out in favor of other filling systems, right? Now, that brings us to today. And what is offered today is actually an improvement, because it creates a much more robust filling system than what this permits. So let me show you that now. Our two Esterbrook push piston pens are joined by a Edison Menlo draw filler. Now, it is slightly different, but I have called it into action because it is more of a demonstrator. I don't think Esterbrook really offers a demonstrator version of this filling system, although perhaps that will come down the line. This offers you a chance to kind of see what's happening inside here, although for reasons that will become clear, it's slightly different. Now, what I will tell you is, so this is called the draw filler. And in fact, Brian Gray, who is the genius behind Edison pens, was using a version of the Vacumatic when he introduced the Menlo as a pump filler, right? So what happened, though, over time was he was repairing these things for people, because people were leaving ink in the pen, people were finding that they needed to replace it, and he wanted something more durable. So what he did was he switched from the kind of Parker style Vacumatic diaphragm filling units to what he calls the draw filler. And the draw filler, like what's in the Esterbrook, is a piston head with O-rings on it, as far as I can tell. I've never taken this out, nor have I had needed to. But what happens is basically similar to the Vacumatic. You push down on this rod and it sends the piston head forward. Unlike the Esterbrook, it doesn't have a spring actuation, so you literally are drawing it back. But as you see me doing this, right, you can see in the breather tube air bubbles and liquid traveling back and forth, right? Why is this better, and why is the Esterbrook version even better than this in some ways? Well, what's better about this, and what I like about the Esterbrook version compared to the Edison, although the Edison is great, I'm not really trying to pick favorites, but I'm just saying one advantage over this, the draw filler, is that it snaps back, right? So rather than having to literally draw the piston head back and forth, you can actually just push and let it go, and so you get more of that one-handed filling technique. Now, what is the advantage over this, besides the obvious that you're not dealing with a rubber diaphragm that at some point you're going to have to replace? The advantage is, I believe, that these versions of the Vacumatic that are found in these modern pens, because of the way the piston functions, they're actually a much more robust system for filling the pen. And what I mean by that is, when you saw me pushing this down, right, you would see that like the diaphragm would kind of come forward and it would take up space within the barrel. But unlike this piston head and the piston head inside here kind of completely seal and push the air forward, right? And so there's some air displacement taking place, but I think it's much more robust, where you have a piston head pushing everything in sort of an even way. And you can kind of see up into this point here, there's like this line that, that entire area of air gets pushed forward, and then the vacuum pressure gets created when this piston head goes backwards. So in a lot of ways, these pens, and particularly the Esterbrook, are a sort of great modern update on a classic, although somewhat limited, vintage technology. So that has been my look at the Esterbrook push piston version of the Estie. Now, I wanted to do this type of episode because for me, some of the history of these pens and where they come from are really interesting. So as I've highlighted today, it's a culmination between a historic Esterbrook model, which in some ways is not really practical for us anymore, and then an update on a vintage filling technology, which has been engineered using more modern technology, more modern techniques to create something that's even better than the original. So I wanted to share that history and that strand with you because to me, that's one of the things that makes fountain pens so enjoyable. I want to thank you all for going on this journey with me. If you've liked what you've seen, please like and subscribe. I look forward to talking to you a lot more about fountain pens, nibs, and everything that goes with them in the future. Thank you so much, and goodbye.